Imagine yourself settling in somewhere quiet, the kind of quiet that feels a little like it's been waiting for you. The air is still. Your shoulders, perhaps without your noticing, begin to loosen. You're about to drift through a piece of history, not the grand, trumpet-blaring sort, but the slow, steady hum of lives long gone. If you're new here, you're warmly invited to subscribe to our quiet corner of YouTube. And if you'd like, leave us a soft little comment below. Let us know where and when you're watching from. Perhaps you're listening late at night, or drifting off with the morning light. Or maybe you just stumbled in here by accident, thinking this was something exciting, in which case sorry about that. Tonight, we're walking slowly into medieval times, not the dinner and joust kind, but the actual life, the kind without theme park safety regulations or conveniently located bathrooms. We're going to talk about why you, with your relatively modern conveniences and perhaps an expectation of at least mild personal space, would not last a day there. And we'll do it gently, as if guiding you down a narrow, cobbled street at dawn, letting the smells, the sounds, the tiny discomforts settle around you like an old wool cloak. We'll pause in doorways, wander into courtyards, and drift through moments that, for the people who lived them, weren't remarkable at all, but might be just enough to make you long for your pillow. You wake to a gray light, because mornings here are rarely gold and clear, unless you happen to be a poet, in which case you're probably lying about it anyway. The air in your small timber house is cool and damp, not the kind of refreshing damp you might imagine from a spa brochure, but the slow, creeping moisture of a structure that has been inhaling fog for decades. Your bed is not really a bed, at least not in the sense you might expect. It's a frame of rough wood, sagging under the weight of a lumpy mattress, stuffed with straw that has developed a personality of its own, prickly in some places, mysteriously soft in others, and alive, possibly, in ways you'd rather not confirm. The blanket over you is wool, thick enough to hold in some heat, but coarse enough to remind you. Each time you shift, that softness was not a high medieval priority. You pull it tighter around your shoulders before sitting up, slowly, because standing too quickly in this room has been known to result in a forehead meeting a low beam. Your head feels heavy, not from late-night indulgence, though that does happen here, but from the lingering cold of the air, the stiffness of sleeping in the same position for hours, and the weight of waking into another day that will be entirely spent surviving it. The smell meets you next. Not a single smell, but a layered arrangement. There's the damp wood of the walls, the faint tang of smoke from the hearth below, the acrid ghost of last night's stew, and the ever-present scent of humanity, your own, your family's. And the clothes you wear until they cannot be worn anymore. This is not a world of scented soaps and rotating wardrobes. It's a world of one tunic, maybe two, each absorbing the life you live in it. Outside, a sound begins soft at first, then more insistent, the clanging of someone's hammer, already working at the forge, because blacksmiths don't get to hit the snooze button. A rooster crows, not politely, with the kind of vocal insistence that suggests this is the most important duty of the day. Somewhere nearby, a child starts crying, the kind of morning cry that is less about distress and more about the injustice of being awake. You push aside the blanket and set your feet on the floorboards, cool and uneven. You are aware, in an absent way, that the floor is cleaner than the street outside. Now that's not saying much. If you're lucky, there's a small basin of water, perhaps collected rain, waiting for you. You splash it on your face, the shock of cold dragging you the rest of the way into the day. Soap exists, yes, but it's not what you think of as soap. It's harsher and reserved for moments when you truly need it. Most mornings, water alone will do. There's no rush, but there's no lingering either. The day begins because it must, and daylight is not to be wasted. You pull on your outer tunic, rough wool again, and maybe a belt if you have one. Shoes, if owned, are leather and stiff. the kind that make you aware of every stone beneath your feet. You step outside into air that smells of earth and smoke, the sky low and heavy, and you begin walking toward whatever work awaits you, not because you're eager, but because in this world, pausing too long means falling behind in ways that are not easily undone. The day's work doesn't wait for you to feel ready, and readiness isn't really a concept here in the way you might think. In medieval life, you done to get to ease into productivity with a coffee and a scroll through something mildly entertaining. The moment you're upright and dressed enough to be seen, you're in motion. The work is not simply something you do to afford life. It is life, threaded into every waking moment without the courtesy of separating on the clock from off the clock. If you live in the countryside, which you probably do because statistically, you're almost certainly not one of the few urban dwellers, your work is dictated by the fields. The seasons are your employer, and they are not generous with paid leave. In spring and summer, you tend to crops with the kind of repetitive care that wears grooves into your body. You bend, pull, carry, and turn the soil, again and again, while the sun presses its slow, steady weight on your back. You don't necessarily think of it as labor. It's simply what must be done to avoid hunger months later. Your hands are rough, calloused not from some quaint woodworking hobby, but from rope, from tools, from constant friction with the material world. Gloves exist, but unless you're of higher status, they're a luxury. If you have animals, their needs greet you before you even start on your own. You walk to the small byre or shed, the air heavy with the warmth and scent of livestock. You shovel what must be shoveled, not with complaint, but with a rhythm learned over years. You feed the animals with what feed you have, knowing it took its own share of work to gather. The cow doesn't care if you're tired. The chickens are unimpressed by any excuse. Their hunger, their needs, they set the pace. In a town, the work looks different, but the constancy is the same. Maybe you're apprenticed to a smith, your day a cycle of heat, hammer, and the dull ache of repetition. Or you might be in a tannery, where the smell sharp, sour, almost alive clings to your skin, no matter how you scrub. Leather is made through labor that is both tedious and unpleasant, but it's necessary, and necessity overrides comfort. Bakers begin before first light, their ovens radiating heat into rooms so hot you could almost forget the winter outside. Tools are simple, and that simplicity is not romantic. A hoe is just a stick with a blade. A plow is a heavy wooden frame pulled by an animal whose patience may not match yours. They are designed not for efficiency as you might know it, but for durability, surviving long seasons of wear without the benefit of replacement parts arriving in a neat package. There is no concept of ergonomic posture. You work bent or crouched, twisting in ways that would make a modern physiotherapist wince. And because this is the only way you've ever worked, your body adapts, but adapts toward survival, not comfort. Chronic pain isn't something you develop later in life. It is simply a part of life from the start, settling into joints and muscles like an old acquaintance. Work is communal, though not in the cheerful team-building sense. You work alongside others, because no one person can manage all of it alone. In the fields, you can hear the scrape of another's hoe, the grunt as someone lifts a load, the low murmur of conversation that drifts and fades. Sometimes the talk is light about weather, about small village happenings. Sometimes it's silence, the kind that comes not from awkwardness, but from exhaustion. If you're lucky enough to be in a trade that produces something saleable, you might walk to the market on certain days, carrying goods with a careful awareness of their worth. Everything is fragile in value spoilage, breakage, or a buyer's whim could make hours of labor worth nothing. Still, you go, because there's no other choice. By midday, there's no lunch break in the modern sense. There's a pause, perhaps, to eat something small, a piece of bread, maybe cheese if you have it, or some form of pottage. It's not a meal meant to restore. It's meant to keep you moving. You eat it without ceremony, perhaps leaning on a fence, perhaps sitting on the edge of the field. And then you stand, and you go back to the work. Because that's what the day demands, and the day will keep demanding until the light fades. And the light will fade sooner than you think. Without electricity, the working hours are chained to the sun. In summer, that means a long drawn-out stretch of labor under a relentless sky. In winter, the day collapses in on itself, short and dim, the work compressed into a tighter, more urgent rhythm. Either way, there's no escaping it. The truth is, in medieval times, work isn't a part of life. It is the shape of life. It fills the hours, it defines the seasons, and it keeps you, barely, one step ahead of hunger. And if you're imagining this sounds exhausting, you're not wrong. But here, there's no space for imagining a different way. There's only tomorrow, waiting, with its own list of tasks you'll never finish. Food in medieval times is not a pleasure in the modern sense. It is not plated with flourish, photographed, or delivered to your door in a box. It is fuel, plain and simple, and you acquire it the way you acquire everything else here through effort that begins far before you put anything in your mouth. Eating is not a break from labor. It is the result of labor. And sometimes the labor takes more energy than the food will replace. In the countryside, most of what you eat comes from what you grow, gather, or raise yourself. And the seasons dictate not only what you have, but how much of it. Bread is a constant presence, though the word bread might give you the wrong picture. This isn't the airy, golden-crusted loaf you're imagining. It's dense, heavy, and uneven, made from grains that have been milled in a way that leaves them coarse and sometimes gritty. If the millstones are worn, the bread might come with a light sprinkling of stone dust, adding a faint crunch that is less rustic texture and more mild dental hazard. Alongside bread, there is pottage of thick, slow-cooked stew of whatever vegetables you have on hand, sometimes with beans or peas, occasionally with a scrap of meat if fortune is on your side. It simmers not because you're trying to coax out flavor, but because this way it can feed more people with less, and it can be kept warm over the fire for hours. Each spoonful is hot and filling, though after the 100th time, the taste becomes less a pleasure and more a familiar background note in the music of your days. Meat is rare unless you are wealthy, or the village happens to be celebrating something significant. For most people, meat is not a daily ingredient, it is an event. When it appears, it may be salted or smoked, not to enhance flavor, but to keep it from turning before you can eat it. The salt is harsh, the texture firm, and the flavor deep in a way that reminds you it once belonged to an animal you might have seen alive just days before. In coastal areas or near rivers, fish is more common, but even then, it is eaten with an awareness that it will not last. Preservation is a battle against time and heat, one you don't always win. Pickling and salting are the closest you get to keeping food for long, and those methods come with their own particular tastes, which may or may not be welcome, depending on how many days you've been eating them. Vegetables are seasonal. In summer, you have more than you can use. In winter, you may find yourself wishing you had been more generous with your summer preservation efforts. Onions, leeks, cabbages, these are staples, hardy and durable, but by the end of winter, they are less crisp and more resigned, their leaves wilted, their flavor fading. Fruits are a rare delight, appearing briefly and disappearing just as quickly, unless you can dry or preserve them in honey. Honey itself is precious, both sweetener and preservative, a taste so rich and rare that you savor it slowly, knowing it won't come again soon. Drinking is its own adaptation to survival. Water is not always safe, especially near settlements where waste and runoff seep into streams. You might drink small ale a week, lightly fermented brew with low alcohol throughout the day. Not to feel anything, but because it is safer than much of the available water. Wine, if you have it, is often thin and sour unless you are in a region that takes pride in its vineyards. Milk is for those who keep animals, but it is more often turned into butter or cheese to last longer. There is no abundance here in the way you might know it. No overflowing shelves, no choice paralysis at the market. Meals are an act of continuity eating today, so you can work tomorrow so you can eat again. You don't eat because you are hungry in the way a modern person might describe hunger. You eat because if you don't, you will not be able to continue. The act of preparing food is as much a part of the day's labor as tending crops or mending fences. Gathering wood for the fire, keeping the fire lit, grinding grain, chopping vegetables, all are tasks that take time and energy before a single bite is consumed. You do not cook dinner here. You live inside the process of creating it, all day, every day. And yet, there is a comfort to it. The familiar weight of the bread, the steam rising from a bowl of pottage on a cold evening, the way everyone eats from the same pot. These are small constants in a world that has few. The flavors may not excite you, but they anchor you. They remind you that you have, at least for now, managed to keep life going one more day. Evening in a medieval settlement doesn't so much arrive as it seeps in. The sun lowers, the light softens, and the air begins to carry that particular chill that tells you the day's work is done whether you like it or not. Without electric light, there's no pushing the boundaries of the day for convenience's sake. The darkness comes on its own schedule, not yours, and you learn very quickly that fighting it is a losing game. The return from the fields, the workshop, or the market is not marked by a sense of leisure. It is more a transition into the next set of tasks that happen to take place indoors. If you are a farmer, you bring in tools and check on the animals one last time, making sure they are fed and sheltered, because a cow that's hungry at night will make sure the whole household knows it. If you work in a craft or trade, you put away your implements carefully, not because you are sentimental about them, but because replacing them would require both time and resources you don't have. Inside, the hearth becomes the heart of the evening. It's the source of light, warmth, and food, and its fire is tended with the kind of quiet diligence that comes from understanding how fragile comfort really is. The glow is soft, flickering, reaching only a few feet into the room. Beyond that, shadows take over, shifting with each movement of the flame. Candles are rare and expensive, made from tallow or beeswax, and they're burned sparingly. Their light is not bright, it's a small halo of visibility in a sea of dark, and you don't waste it. The meal is much like the one you had at midday, only perhaps warmer and slower. Pottage, bread, maybe something slightly richer if the day has been good. You eat it seated on benches or stools, with no tableware beyond a knife, a wooden spoon, or your hands. The bread is used as much for scooping as for eating. Conversation, if it happens, is quiet and practical. There's no loud banter, no theatrical storytelling, just the soft exchange of information about the day's work, the weather, the small events that make up life here. Outside, the settlement changes. The streets, if they can be called that, empty quickly. People avoid moving about after dark unless necessary, not only because it's harder to see, but because there's little reason to. Night belongs to those who have reason to use its cover. Sometimes that's animals. Sometimes it's people you'd rather not meet. The stillness that settles is not peaceful in the way you might imagine. It's watchful, and it presses close. Inside, your body begins to feel the weight of the day, not the abstract tiredness of a long meeting or a late night scrolling through distractions, but the deep, physical heaviness that comes from hours of labor. Your hands ache faintly. Your legs carry that steady throb of work done without pause. Your back reminds you of every time you bent, lifted, or twisted in the past 12 hours. This is not the kind of exhaustion that makes you restless. It's the kind that folds you into stillness, whether you want it to or not. You prepare for bed without ceremony. The same straw-filled mattress waits for you, smelling faintly of the day's sweat and the smoke from the hearth. If the weather is cold, you pull your cloak over yourself for extra warmth. If it's warm, you shift restlessly in the heavy wool, but you don't discard it. You'll want it again before morning. There's no changing into something soft and clean for sleep. You wear what you've been wearing, perhaps loosening a belt, perhaps removing a layer. The sounds of the settlement at night are few but distinct. The low murmur of someone's voice through a wall, the creak of wood as the structure cools, the occasional bark of a dog, or the clop of hooves if someone is still moving about. In winter, the wind seeps in through gaps in the walls, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and ash. In summer, the air is warmer, but it brings the buzz of insects and the rustle of whatever small creatures feel safe enough to emerge. There's no thought of staying up late for entertainment. The day is over, and the night offers nothing but rest, so you take it. You lie back, feeling the uneven give of the straw beneath you, listening to the hearth's last embers settling into quiet, and you let the darkness wrap around you. The world outside might continue in its own way, foxes moving through fields, a neighbor shifting in their sleep, but in your small space, it's just you, the dark, and the knowledge that in a few hours, the day will begin again exactly as it always does. This is how the medieval day ends, not with celebration, not with relaxation, but with the closing of a cycle that will open again at dawn, carrying the same work, the same routines, the same steady pace of survival. Imagine now that instead of waking in the cramped half-light of a peasant's loft or a craftsman's narrow shop, you open your eyes to a different kind of space. The air is still cool, the walls still close by modern standards, but the bedding beneath you is thicker, the straw better stuffed, the wool softer. You are not rich in the way kings are rich, but in medieval terms. You are important enough for people to know your name, or at least your title, and to bow slightly when you pass. That is, if you were this particular figure we're about to follow. Let us say his name, though the exact one hardly matters for the lesson, belongs to a man who lived somewhere between the 12th and 14th centuries. We'll call him Sir Geoffrey, partly because it sounds suitably medieval, and partly because it spares us from choosing between the 10 other common names of the period, most of which you've already heard in every costume drama. Sir Geoffrey was a knight, which in your mind may conjure images of gleaming armor, noble quests, and a certain rugged, photogenic heroism. In reality, the job was less about dramatic jousts and more about land management, political maneuvering, and a constant balancing act between personal ambition and the obligations of feudal loyalty. To understand Sir Geoffrey's life, you have to understand the web he lived in a world where identity was defined less by personal qualities and more by the land you held, the people you owed allegiance to, and the people who owed you in return. He was born into a noble family, which sounds glamorous until you realize that noble in medieval Europe was a category that included plenty of people who were more anxious than powerful. Nobility meant you didn't work the fields yourself, but it also meant your fortunes were bound tightly to the goodwill, or at least the tolerance of people above you in the hierarchy. As a younger son, Geoffrey would not inherit the family estate outright. That privilege went to the eldest. His path, like that of many younger sons, was set early. Serve as a page in another noble household. Learn the expected skills of horsemanship, swordsmanship, and perhaps most crucially, how to be useful to those more important than you without appearing to threaten them. These lessons began when he was still a boy, small enough that the sword he was expected to wield seemed more like a piece of scaffolding than a weapon. Training was not the romantic montage you might imagine. It was hours of repetitive drills, the slow building of muscle and endurance, the wearing in of skin until calluses replaced blisters. Falling from a horse wasn't an occasional accident. It was an expected part of learning. Being hit during sparring was not treated as a setback. It was a reminder to keep your guard up. And while he learned to read and write, a skill still rare outside the church, His literacy was focused on practical matters: records, charters, correspondence. He was not expected to compose poetry, though it was useful to at least understand it when it was performed at court. The political world he grew into was one of constant undercurrents. Alliances were made and unmade with the shift of a single favor or insult. Marriage was less about love and more about the strategic linking of estates and titles. Land was power, and power was fragile, always at risk from ambitious neighbors or a displeased overlord. Geoffrey's early years as a knight were not marked by sweeping campaigns, but by patrols along contested borders, the occasional skirmish over grazing rights, and the far more exhausting work of diplomacy, attending feasts, delivering messages, lending his presence at events designed to remind everyone of who owed loyalty to whom. When called to arms, his duties were not to ride alone into glory, but to lead a small contingent of men-at-arms, each of whom depended on him for food, pay, and direction. This meant ensuring they were equipped, fed, and at least moderately sober before any confrontation. Battles, when they came, were muddy, chaotic affairs, more about endurance and cohesion than gallant individual acts. Armor was heavy, visibility was poor, and victory often came down to who could stay on their feet the longest. To modern eyes, Geoffrey's life might look rigid, even suffocating. To him, it was the only life imaginable. His days were defined by a cycle of obligations to his lord, to his family, to the church that left little room for personal invention. But within that narrow corridor, he learned to maneuver, to read people as closely as he read the shifting lines of a battlefield, to understand that survival in the medieval nobility was not about winning every conflict, but about making sure you were still there for the next one. And so, Sir Geoffrey moved through his world with a careful step, armored not just in steel, but in the knowledge that in a society where your worth was measured in loyalty and land, the most dangerous thing you could do was stand too far out from the crowd. His was a life lived under constant watch, not only from his peers and superiors, but from the invisible weight of tradition and expectation that pressed down as surely as the helmet on his head. Sir Geoffrey's early years were not his own, not in the way you might think of childhood now. You could say he was born into privilege, but privilege, in the medieval sense, is not freedom. It is obligation that starts before you can even tie your own belt. From the moment he was old enough to understand that the adults around him weren't just there to feed and protect him, but to shape him into something useful, his life was already moving on rails he didn't lay. As the second son, Geoffrey was destined for service. The eldest boy would inherit the manor, the lands, the tenants, and the authority that came with them. Geoffrey, by contrast, would inherit expectations. Not the pleasant kind, but the sort that come wrapped in an unspoken agreement that you will devote yourself entirely to supporting the family's position without ever openly competing with your elder brother. This arrangement worked perfectly for everyone except, of course, the younger sons themselves. By the age of 7 or 8 in age you might associate with early school years, Geoffrey was sent away to live in the household of another noble. This wasn't a punishment. It was the standard path for boys of his rank. The idea was to learn manners, horsemanship, and the art of service in a place where your family name would not protect you from correction. It was an exchange of sorts, families trading the care of their sons like chess pieces, ensuring alliances stayed warm and future obligations stayed remembered. Life as a page was a blur of duties that seemed small at the time, but were the foundation of everything that followed. He cleaned and maintained armor that he would not yet wear. He learned to carry messages without forgetting or altering a single word, no matter how tedious the content. He memorized the seating order for feasts, because putting the wrong person in the wrong place could cause the kind of insult that led to years of petty revenge. He poured wine carefully, without spilling, and learned how to hold a serving dish so that it could be offered without seeming either arrogant or hesitant. two sins equally disliked by the medieval nobility. And then there were the horses. You could not be a knight without mastering them. And mastery was not just about riding well. Geoffrey mucked out stalls, brushed hides, cleaned hooves, and learned the subtle language of reins and pressure. He learned that a warhorse was not a docile companion. It was a heavy, living weapon that required respect. He learned to fall and get up quickly, because showing hesitation in the saddle was as bad as falling in the first place. Weapons training began early, though it was not the glamorous clashing of swords you might picture. At first, it was wooden swords and endless drills forward, parry, step back, again and again until the body could do it without thought. Shields were heavy even in practice form, and Geoffrey learned to carry their weight for hours until his arms felt as though they belonged to someone else entirely. Archery practice came too, though as a noble, he was not expected to be a master of the bow that was for the lower-ranked soldiers. Still, knowing how to handle one had its uses. His education also included literacy, something rare, outside the church. He learned to read Latin, because most official documents were written in it, and to write with a careful hand, since letters might be carried for days, and must still be legible at their destination. He copied passages from religious texts, not for the sake of spiritual reflection, but because copying was how one learned the forms of letters, and the discipline to keep them even. Discipline was the unspoken centerpiece of it all. Every act, from the way he stood in a hall to the way he addressed someone of higher rank, was shaped by the need to maintain control of posture, of words, of the smallest gestures. To lose that control was to invite insult or suspicion. And in a world where a man's position was as fragile as a truce in springtime, that was dangerous. By the time Geoffrey was a teenager, he had already been trained to exist within the narrow space his society allowed. He had learned to observe more than he spoke, to anticipate the needs of those above him, and to find quiet ways to make himself indispensable. He understood that everything from the way he cleaned a bridle to the way he phrased a greeting was a test, and that passing those tests was the only way forward. It was a life that might seem suffocating now, but to Geoffrey, it was simply the shape of the world. He didn't imagine an alternative, because imagining an alternative was the sort of thing that could get you branded as untrustworthy, or worse, idealistic. And in the medieval noble class, idealism was not a virtue, it was a liability. By the time Sir Geoffrey reached his early 20s, the scaffolding of his youth training, service, deference had hardened into the frame of his adult life. He was now a knight in full, which meant he had, in theory, achieved a kind of independence. In practice, this simply meant that his obligations had shifted in scale rather than lessened. No longer the page who polished another man's armor, he now wore his own. But with the armor came the weight of responsibility, and unlike the steel plates, there was no way to set it down at the end of the day. His first real test came not on a grand battlefield, but in a border dispute so petty and local that it would never earn a place in the chronicles except, perhaps, as a half-line in the records of a land court. Two neighboring manors were contesting the rights to a strip of meadow, and because it was early summer, that strip happened to be worth something. Hay meant feed for animals, and feed meant survival through winter. To an outsider, the quarrel might have seemed absurd. To those involved, it was a matter of life and death disguised as an argument about property lines. Geoffrey's role was to lead a small party to protect his lord's claim, which was a polite way of saying, make sure the other side doesn't to cut the hay first. This was less about open combat and more about demonstrating readiness to engage if pushed. The days passed at a slow dance of posturing men from each side, watching one another across the disputed grass, sharpening blades in plain sight, occasionally riding a few paces forward to make a point, and back again. When tempers finally boiled over, it wasn't the dramatic clash of armored men you might imagine. It was a scramble, a series of shoves, shouted insults, and a few blows that left bruises, but no fatalities. In the end, the dispute was settled by a compromise in which neither side was satisfied, which meant it was probably fair. A few years later, a more serious summons came. His lord was obligated to send knights to support a campaign, one of those sprawling feudal obligations, where the reasons were couched in noble rhetoric, but boiled down to keeping alliances intact. Geoffrey rode out with a small retinue, traveling for days over muddy roads, sleeping in damp fields, and arriving at what could generously be called a siege. It was not the kind of siege that ended quickly. The target was a modestly fortified town whose walls were sturdy enough to require patience, but not strong enough to inspire awe. Days turned into weeks of waiting, cutting off supplies, watching for openings, and dealing with the slow erosion of morale. The moment of action, when it came, was not a glorious charge. It was a calculated push when the defenders were low on food and less inclined to hold the walls at all costs. Geoffrey found himself climbing a ladder slick with rain, the weight of his armor making every rung feel twice as high, the air thick with the smell of wet timber, smoke, and human effort. He reached the parapet, engaged in a few brief, frantic exchanges of blows, and then the defenders yielded. Victory tasted less like triumph and more like exhaustion, followed by the unromantic work of securing the place and dealing with prisoners. These events shaped Geoffrey not through any sudden burst of heroism, but by reinforcing the reality that his world ran on endurance, not spectacle. Success was measured in holding ground, keeping men fed, maintaining loyalty, not in winning songs or tailies. Each engagement, each negotiation, each journey along dangerous roads was another thread in the web that bound him to his lord and his peers. And yet, these were also the years when he began to see the limits of the role. He noticed how quickly loyalty shifted when fortunes changed, how easily a lord might withdraw favor, how the intricate lattice of obligation could be rearranged without warning. He learned to keep his ambitions quiet, his counsel careful, and his alliances broad enough that if one branch snapped, the others might still hold. The medieval world liked to pretend that honor was a constant, but Geoffrey knew better. Honor was situational, mutable, and often defined by the people with the most power to declare it. What endured was not the glory of the moment, but the ability to adapt when the moment passed. By the time Sir Geoffrey entered the later decades of his life, the sharp edges of youthful ambition had worn down into something quieter, though not necessarily gentler. He had survived enough campaigns, small and large, to know that no victory was ever final, and no defeat ever entirely fatal, at least for those who managed to remain useful. His joints ached in damp weather, which, in his part of the world, meant most of the year. His sword arm had lost some of its speed, but he compensated with the kind of calculated caution that only years of surviving other people's mistakes can teach. Geoffrey's responsibilities shifted gradually away from direct combat toward the steady, less glamorous work of governance. He was trusted to oversee a manor in his lord's absence, which meant managing tenants, settling disputes, collecting rents, and ensuring that the proper share of goods found its way upward in the feudal chain. This was administration, without modern conveniences, no ledgers neatly printed, no system of receipts beyond what could be written by hand and stored in a chest. Records were kept on parchment that curled in the damp, in ink that sometimes faded or smudged, leaving future generations to guess at what exactly had been agreed. He also became a figure of mediation, a role both respected and resented. His reputation for measured judgment meant that neighbors would call on him to resolve conflicts, which sounds noble until you remember that resolution, in the medieval sense, usually meant convincing everyone to accept the least bad outcome. No one left entirely satisfied, and that was the point. It kept resentments simmering at a manageable level rather than boiling over into raids or sabotage. In these years, he attended more feasts than battles. though the two environments had more in common than one might think. Feasts, like campaigns, required endurance, careful attention to alliances, and the occasional willingness to say just enough and no more. Sitting beside a powerful guest and letting them speak at length while you nod at the right moments could be as politically valuable as holding a breach in a wall. Marriage, which had come earlier in his life as part of a tidy arrangement between families, produced children who were now old enough to begin their own lives of obligation. His eldest son was being groomed to inherit whatever Geoffrey had gained, while younger sons were already being placed into the households of other nobles, just as Geoffrey had been. His daughters' marriages were carefully negotiated for maximum strategic advantage, a process that could take years of quiet bargaining disguised as polite hospitality. Contradictions became more visible with age. Geoffrey had spent his life serving a system that claimed to reward loyalty and stability. Yet he had seen too many loyal men lose everything through no fault of their own. He had enforced rules about land and rights that he privately knew were uneven at best, designed more to preserve hierarchy than to dispense justice. And yet, he also saw that without those same rules, the fragile structure holding his world together would collapse into something worse chaos without even the thin veneer of order. When people spoke of him in his later years, they did so with a kind of measured respect. He was dependable, careful, and rarely surprised by events, which in the medieval world was as close to wisdom as most dared to claim. He was not the sort of figure to inspire ballads, but neither was he the sort to be quietly forgotten in the next generation. His name appeared in charters, in witness lists, in the dusty back pages of legal disputes small, unglamorous markers of a man who had learned how to stay relevant without overstepping. By the time he died quietly, at home, which in itself was a rare kind of victory, his legacy was less about great deeds than about endurance. He left behind land that was slightly more secure than he had inherited, alliances that were still intact, and a family positioned to continue in much the same way. No one would tell stories of his daring or his conquests, but then again, he had never relied on stories to keep him alive. In the end, Sir Geoffrey's life was a reminder that in the medieval world, survival could be its own form of greatness. To last was to win, even if no one sang about you afterward. And in the long stretch of history, sometimes the quiet survivors outnumber the celebrated heroes by a wide margin. Let's step away from Sir Geoffrey's tidy ledger books, half-repaired manor roofs, and quietly strategic dinner seating charts, and turn towards something a little less certain, something that makes historians tilt their heads, squint at fragments of evidence, and mutter phrases like, "We can't be entirely sure," with an odd mix of frustration and delight. The medieval world is thick with such mysteries because it was very good at recording what it thought was important taxes, land boundaries, noble lineages, and very bad at recording anything it assumed was too obvious to bother writing down. Which means that centuries later, we can be left puzzling over details that were once as commonplace as the smell of a thatched roof after rain. One such mystery, or perhaps perpetual question, comes from the peculiar, half-factual, half-folkloric accounts of the so-called Green Children of Woolpit. It's the sort of story that sits uncomfortably between history and myth, and whether it happened exactly as described or not, it has refused to disappear from the edges of medieval record-keeping. The story surfaces in England in the 12th century, in a Suffolk village called Woolpit, named, with charming practicality, after the wolf pits dug there to trap predators. According to the chroniclers, one day the villagers discovered two children near one of these pits, a boy and a girl, speaking an unfamiliar language, dressed in clothing made from an odd, unknown material, and most memorably green. Not looking unwell green, but genuinely, noticeably, unnaturally green in skin tone. The accounts vary in small details, as medieval accounts always do when they pass through multiple retellings, but the essentials remain the same. The children were taken in by the villagers. who tried to feed them, only to discover that they refused all food except raw beans, which they ate with apparent relief. Over time, their skin gradually lost its green hue, and they began to learn the local language. The boy, unfortunately, died not long after, but the girl grew up, integrating into the community, even marrying. She explained, when she could finally communicate, that she and her brother had come from a place called St. Martin's Land, where the sun never shone and the light was a perpetual twilight. Now, here is where the medieval chroniclers do that thing they do so well: present the facts as they heard them, in a calm, unembellished tone, as if describing something no more unusual than a fair's market day. There is no suggestion that the story should be read as allegory, nor any effort to explain it beyond a few theories, perhaps. They came from a nearby village, but had been poisoned by minerals in the soil, or perhaps they had been hidden underground and developed their unusual coloring as a result. And then, having presented the puzzle, the record simply moves on. For us, centuries later, the Green Children are the kind of historical curiosity that refuses to be neatly filed away. They sit at the intersection of the medieval appetite for wonder and the frustrating gaps in medieval evidence. Were they simply strangers with an unusual illness or diet? Was their green skin a mistranslation of a word meaning pale or sickly? Or was the whole account a form of moral tale, half remembered and retold until it settled into local lore? The truth, if there ever was one, is not recoverable in any satisfying way. But that's part of the charm or the irritation of mysteries from this time. The medieval mind was not bothered by what it couldn't fully explain. It was content to record the remarkable and let it remain so, which leaves us, hundreds of years later, staring into the same gap they did, wondering what exactly it was that the villagers of Woolpit saw that day, and why they thought it worth writing down at all. To understand the Green Children's story, or at least to understand why medieval people might have told it without the need to prove or disprove it, you have to step into the mental landscape of the 12th century. This was a world where the boundary between the everyday and the extraordinary was far more porous than it is now. The supernatural wasn't a separate category to be debated in books. It was folded into daily life like an extra layer of the sky. If something unusual happened, it wasn't so much a violation of natural law as it was a reminder that nature had more laws than you had personally accounted for. The England of the mid-1100s was a patchwork of small villages, each with its own rhythms and its own margins of isolation. Woolpit itself sat in the county of Suffolk, a landscape of rolling fields, scattered woodlands, and marshy ground. Travel was slow, often uncomfortable, and limited for most people to what could be reached within a day's walk. That meant any stranger was inherently interesting, doubly so if they arrived without explanation, and triply so if they arrived speaking an incomprehensible language and wearing unfamiliar clothes. In terms of written sources, we owe most of what we know about the Green Children to two chroniclers: Ralph of Coggeshall, a Cistercian monk with a taste for recording wonders, and William of Newburgh, a historian whose works blend meticulous detail with the occasional dip into the inexplicable. Both were writing decades after the supposed event, which means they were relying on reports already filtered through memory, local gossip, and the narrative instincts of whoever told them the story first. It's not quite hearsay, but it's a distant cousin. Archaeology can't confirm the event itself. It is not as if Green Children leave behind distinctive ruins, but it can tell us something about the world they were said to appear in. Excavations in Suffolk and surrounding areas reveal a society that was, for its time, reasonably prosperous. Farming villages had access to pottery, metal tools, and a variety of crops. The people lived in timber-framed houses with wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs, structures that were surprisingly durable if maintained, but could decay into nothing in just a few decades if left untended. Diet, as we've already explored, was heavy on grains and legumes, with beans in particular being a staple crop. It is not impossible that a child who refused to eat anything but beans was simply acting out of familiarity. If you grew up somewhere where beans were the main food, refusing other fare might be less stubbornness than self-preservation. The green skin has prompted modern theories, ranging from chlorosis, a form of anemia common in malnourished populations, to arsenic poisoning from contaminated soil or water. Both would be plausible in a medieval rural setting, especially if the children came from a marginal, neglected community. Yet the chroniclers give no hint that they sought a natural explanation. The color was recorded as a fact, and the strangeness of it was left to stand on its own. What's most revealing is that the story was preserved at all. Medieval chronicles were selective, often focusing on political events, church affairs, and notable deaths. For a tale like this to make it into two separate accounts suggests it was widely known, and perhaps widely debated, even if we have no record of those debates. It fits into a broader medieval genre of wonders, unusual happenings that were neither miracles nor disasters, but something in between, lodged in the mind like a burr. For the people of Woolpit, the children may have been absorbed into village life and eventually forgotten, their story fading until it was only revived when a monk or a historian found it worth noting down. For us, the archaeological record provides the backdrop, but not the plot. We can reconstruct the houses they might have slept in, the beans they might have eaten, the fields they might have crossed, but the moment of their arrival, the thing that makes the story stick, remains outside the reach of spades and trowels. When faced with a story like the Green Children of Woolpit, modern readers tend to lean in two directions, either toward skeptical dismissal or toward elaborate theorizing, the medieval chroniclers. By contrast, lean toward simple acceptance, recording the account as something worth noting without demanding an airtight explanation. That leaves us, centuries later, with the slightly ridiculous task of supplying the explanations they didn't bother to. One of the most mundane theories, and therefore, in many ways, the most plausible, is dietary deficiency. Chlorosis, sometimes called the green sickness in later centuries, was a type of anemia that could cause a pale greenish tinge to the skin. Poor diet, low iron, and limited variety in food could easily produce such symptoms. In this view, the children were simply from a malnourished, isolated community, and once fed properly in Woolpit, their color faded because their health improved. It's tidy, it's natural, and it robs the story of its mystery, which, naturally, makes it less satisfying for those who enjoy a little wonder in their history. Another explanation is environmental poisoning. Arsenic occurs naturally in certain soils, and in sufficient quantities can cause skin discoloration and a host of other symptoms. If the children came from an area where water or crops were contaminated, the greenish hue could be a visible sign of chronic exposure. This idea has the advantage of being physically possible, and the disadvantage of making the tale sound like a medieval environmental health report accurate, perhaps, but distinctly unromantic. Then there are the linguistic theories. Some scholars have suggested that the children were Flemish immigrants or refugees, displaced by political unrest or famine, who spoke no English and wore unfamiliar clothing. Suffolk had experienced waves of Flemish settlement, and tensions between locals and outsiders were not uncommon. The green skin might have been a figurative expression misunderstood by later writers, a description of sickliness, foreignness, or even inexperience, rather than literal pigmentation. In this reading, the land of St. Martin could be a garbled reference to a real Flemish village, filtered through a medieval ear, and then through centuries of retelling. But of course, once you've opened the door to theories, the more whimsical ones inevitably slip in. Over time, the Green Children have been claimed by folklorists as possible fairy folk, who wandered from another world into our own. The constant twilight of St. Martin's Land fits neatly into certain strands of European folklore, where parallel realms exist alongside our own, separated by little more than a hidden path or an accidental crossing. The beans, in this interpretation, are not just familiar food. They're the tether to the children's original home, their one remaining connection to the place they came from. And then, inevitably, the story has been embraced by the kind of speculative thinking that thrives on the internet and in late-night conversations. The suggestion that the children were not from another earthly place at all, but from somewhere far less local. Their unusual skin tone, strange language, and unfamiliar clothing have been recast as the traces of extraterrestrial origin, perhaps shipwrecked on Earth, perhaps accidentally stranded after a miscalculated journey through time or space. The medieval chroniclers, in this reading, were simply the first to record what was essentially a rural UFO encounter. These more fanciful interpretations reveal as much about us as they do about the original story, where the medieval mind was content to note the unusual and leave it at that. The modern mind tends to demand either a rational explanation or a thrilling one, and preferably both. We like our mysteries solved, or, failing that, expanded into something even stranger. Yet the truth is, none of these theories can be proven. The sources are too few, too far removed from the event, and too sparse in detail to allow for certainty. Which means that the Green Children remain suspended in the same in-between space they've occupied for nearly 9 centuries. Not entirely believable, not entirely dismissible, and quietly resistant to our need for neat endings. The trouble and the charm of the Green Children is that the more you try to pin them down, the more they slip away. They don't fit neatly into the categories we like to keep history in. They are not clearly a political event, though they happened in a period where everything had political implications. They are not clearly a piece of folklore, though they bear all the hallmarks of a tale told and retold until its details are worn smooth. They are not clearly a miracle, though their arrival must have felt to the villagers like something halfway between a blessing and a puzzle. The medieval chroniclers, for all their carefulness in recording, left us only what they thought worth noting. They did not, for example, describe exactly how green the children were. Was it the faint greenish pallor of someone in poor health? The vivid leaf-toned green of a storybook illustration? Something in between? They did not tell us whether their hair was dark or fair, whether their eyes were wide with fear or curiosity, whether they seemed old for their age or small for it. We don't know if they clung to each other when they were found, or if they had already grown wary of strangers in a world it clearly was not their own. We are left instead with fragments, details that could be literal or figurative, true or half-true, the result of careful observation or the product of a single villager as memory, sharpened by the need to tell a good story. In this way, the Green Children stand in for a much larger truth about the Middle Ages, that we are, and will always be, piecing together the lives of people who did not think of themselves as subjects for future study. They lived in their moment, surrounded by what they knew, rarely stopping to explain it for those who might come later. And perhaps that's the most medieval thing about the Green Children. Not the green skin, not the strange language, but the fact that their presence was recorded without urgency to solve it. We, with our habit of investigation and our belief that any mystery can be cracked with enough data, find this frustrating. But in the 12th century, the world was full of things that had no tidy explanation. A comet in the sky, a child who survived an illness that killed 3 of their siblings, a flock of birds migrating in an unusual pattern. People noticed these things, sometimes noted them down, and then continued with their work. It's worth remembering, too, that mystery in the medieval mindset was not automatically something to be solved. In religious terms, a mystery was often something meant to be contemplated, not resolved. The unknown was not necessarily a flaw in understanding. It was an accepted part of the world structure. To the villagers of Woolpit, the arrival of the Green Children may have been surprising, but it was no more or less extraordinary than the dozens of other unusual events life might throw their way. There is also the possibility, slim, But worth considering that the Green Children were not remarkable to the villagers for as long as we might think. People adapt quickly to novelty. Once the initial curiosity faded, they became simply the children, known for their bean-eating habits, perhaps their odd speech, and eventually just for the work they did alongside everyone else. The girl's marriage into the community suggests that whatever had set her apart at first eventually became unimportant. She ceased to be a living curiosity and became just another thread in the village fabric. This is where the story takes on a quiet irony. In our time, the Green Children have been written about, speculated over, fictionalized, and even used as symbols for otherness and migration. But in their own time, they may have ended their lives not as mysteries, but as ordinary people. They may have preferred it that way. After all, living as a perpetual question mark in the minds of your neighbors is not necessarily an enviable role. And yet, here we are, centuries later, keeping their strangeness alive. The village of Woolpit still acknowledges the story. Writers and researchers still turn it over like a smooth stone in the hand. It has the peculiar resilience of a tale that is too odd to dismiss, too thin to explain, and too stubborn to die. If you stand in Woolpit today, you can still find the traces of its medieval past, the old church, the outlines of ancient earthworks, the landscape that has rolled and shifted, but not erased itself. Somewhere in that land is the spot where the children were found. Whether it's a field edge, a shaded hollow, or a patch of ground now under someone's garden, it remains unmarked. The earth keeps its secrets, as it always has. The Green Children remind us quietly, without drama, that much of history lives in that unmarked ground, that we can reconstruct 1,000 details about the texture of medieval life, but there will always be people, moments, and stories that refuse to yield to our questions. And perhaps that's not a flaw in the record, but its own kind of gift, a reminder that the past is not ours to fully know, only to visit in fragments, like strangers in a place that was never built for us. If the daily life of a medieval peasant was defined by necessity, and the existence of someone like Sir Geoffrey was shaped by obligation, the life of the medieval elite, those who sat high enough on the social ladder to see the top, was defined by a combination of display, maintenance, and an almost theatrical awareness of one's own position in the hierarchy. It was not leisure in the modern sense, nor freedom in the absolute sense, but it was life lived with a wider margin between effort and survival. Imagine waking up in a bed that is not just a frame with a straw mattress, but a frame carved from solid oak, hung with thick curtains to hold in warmth. The mattress is still stuffed with straw. There's no escaping that. But the straw is fresher, the ticking cleaner, and the coverings more substantial. You rise in a room that smells less of damp timber and more of smoke from the hearth in the corner, which has been kept alight by servants, whose job it is to ensure that you are never met with cold air if it can be helped. The clothes you put on in the morning are not the same ones you wore to bed, and they do not serve only the purpose of covering your body. They announce your rank before you say a word. Fabrics are dyed, perhaps not in the richest hues, which are reserved for royalty, but certainly in colors that make it clear you are not of the working class. A belt might be embroidered, a clasp set with a small stone, a sleeve cut to a length that is impractical for physical labor, but ideal for demonstrating that you do none. Your day begins not with the pressing urgency of survival, but with the ordering of your household survival for you. This involves a quiet orchestration of work you will not personally perform. Servants carry water for washing, lay out the garments you'll wear, and bring food to the table. That table is not a permanent fixture. Furniture is valuable and often moved depending on the occasion. But when it is laid, it carries bread, perhaps eggs, possibly some cured meat, and ale or wine, because clean water is as unreliable here as anywhere else. From there, the rhythm of your day depends on your specific role within the elite structure. If you are the lord or lady of an estate, A morning might begin with hearing petitions from tenants or stewards' complaints about boundary disputes, requests for wood-cutting rights, reports on crop yields or livestock health. If you are a guest in another noble household, your role is more performative, appearing at the right times, speaking with the right people, and ensuring that your presence contributes to the subtle accounting of favors and obligations that runs beneath every social encounter. Leisure exists, but it is never aimless. Hunting, for example, is recreation, but also demonstration of your wealth, because only the wealthy can afford the land and the animals. Your physical skill, and your right to control access to the resources of your territory. A hunt is not simply for food, it's a moving display of hierarchy, from the lords and ladies in their finery to the retainers who manage the hounds and carry the kills. Even religious observance, which might seem the great leveler, takes on a distinctive shape for the elite. You attend services in the best clothes you own, in a place in the church reserved for your family, and your offerings are not just coins, but sometimes objects, candlesticks, embroidered altar cloths that will bear your name long after you're gone. Piety is genuine for many, but it's also a form of legacy building, an investment in the memory of your generosity. Your surroundings reinforce your status at every turn. The hall where you dine is larger than most peasants' homes, its walls hung with tapestries that do the double work of decoration and insulation. The floors might be strewn with rushes, perhaps even sweetened with herbs, though they will be changed far less often than you might like to think. Light comes from candles and torches, more plentiful here than in the cottages below, though even for you, night is something to be managed rather than banished. What sets elite life apart is not the absence of discomfort, it is the insulation from its sharpest edges. You are still subject to the cold of winter, the heat of summer, the reach of illness, and the whims of politics. But you face them with layers of buffer. Servants to fetch the water, stewards to manage the land, physicians of varying effectiveness to attend your ailments, and above all, the knowledge that your position means you will be among the last to feel the full weight of hardship when it comes. It is a life that looks effortless from the outside, but which is in truth a constant performance. Every garment worn, every gesture made, every interaction conducted in public or private feeds into the larger script of who you are and what place you occupy in the story of your time. You are both actor and audience in the ongoing pageant of rank, wealth, and influence, and as with any performance, the work is in making it look like no work at all. If life for the medieval elite is a performance, then its routines are the script, repeated so often that the lines become second nature. They are not improvised, they are carefully ordered, honed over centuries to communicate wealth, control, and a command of resources that most people in the medieval world could barely imagine. For the elite, daily life is not about mere survival. It is about maintaining an entire ecosystem of symbols that prove you belong where you are. The day begins later than for peasants, but not in a way that would feel like luxury to a modern mind. Dawn still matters. There is no ignoring the sun in a world without electric light, but the first hours of the day are handled by others. Stewards and senior servants are already at work while you are still behind bed curtains, consulting accounts, issuing instructions to cooks, stable hands, and cleaners. By the time you rise, your chamber is warmed, your garments laid out, and your first meal is waiting. Breakfast, if taken at all, tends to be light, perhaps bread with butter or cheese, ale, and sometimes meat or fish left from the previous evening's meal. The privilege lies not so much in the variety, but in the certainty. A peasant might not know if there will be food at all that morning. You do. You are insulated from the variables of weather and crop failure by the labor of dozens of people who make sure your table is never bare. Afterward comes the business of the estate. If you are the lord, you might spend the morning hearing petitions, matters of boundary disputes, complaints about stolen livestock, requests for mercy on rents. Your decisions carry weight, not just because you are in charge, but because the decisions themselves reinforce your authority. Sometimes you delegate these matters to a bailiff, but being seen to sit in judgment has its own political value. If you are the lady of the household, your domain is different, but no less essential. You oversee the running of the hall and kitchens, the management of stores, the allocation of resources for clothing and linens. You might direct the making of ale, supervise spinning and weaving, or arrange the seasonal preservation of food. You are also responsible for the care of guests, because guests are never just guests. They are potential allies, spies, messengers, or suitors, and the way they are treated sends ripples through your social network. Meals are major events. The midday dinner is the largest, and it is both nourishment and theater. You sit at the high table, raised on a dais, so that everyone in the hall can see you. Courses arrive in order soup or pottage, roasted meats or fish, pies filled with spiced mixtures, sometimes exotic fruits if your household can afford imports. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves are not merely for flavor. They are status markers, tangible proof that your household has connections to the far reaches of trade. Entertainment accompanies the meal. Musicians, jesters, or storytellers might perform, but more often the entertainment is conversational discussions of politics, alliances, hunting successes, or the marriages being negotiated between families. It is a space where information is exchanged as strategically as coin. Servants move constantly, refilling cups, clearing dishes, keeping the hall in motion without breaking the rhythm of the occasion. Afternoons might involve estate inspections, hunting parties, or hawking. Hunting is less about securing meat, though the catch will certainly be eaten, and more about demonstrating skill, dominance over nature, and the right to land. A noble's hawk is not just a bird. It is a living badge of prestige, its jesses and hoods decorated with fine work to match its owner's status. There are also obligations to the wider feudal structure. You might be summoned to attend your overlord, to bring armed men for a campaign, or to appear at court for a legal hearing. Travel is slow and uncomfortable by modern standards, but the ability to travel with a retinue, carrying your own bedding, utensils, and supplies, is another visible sign of rank. You arrive not as an individual, but as a moving household, bringing your world with you. Evenings, once darkness sets in, are quieter but not idle. The great hall might be used for more intimate gatherings, a small feast for a visiting dignitary, or the telling of news from the wider world. Musicians might play softly, but there is rarely unstructured leisure. Even in the most private moments, there is an awareness that every word, every glance, every decision will be remembered and repeated. The privileges of the upper class are not just about what you have, they are about what you never have to do. You will not plow. You will not carry water. You will not tend a fire through the night unless you choose to for sport. You will not walk alone through the dark to fetch anything you need. Your comfort is constructed from the labor of many hands. And though the structure may seem solid, it rests on a constant balancing act of loyalty, obligation, and appearances. It is a life where the stakes are always higher than they appear, where a well-hosted feast can earn you an ally, and a poorly handled guest can make you an enemy. And because every action is observed, there is little room for error. To live as medieval elite is to live in a kind of permanent spotlight, not the glaring, public kind of modern fame, but the softer, relentless illumination of a candle that never quite goes out. If the daily routines of the medieval elite form the scaffolding of their lives, then political maneuvering, cultural display, and the careful curation of influence are the beams and rafters that keep the whole structure from collapsing. In a world without standing armies in the modern sense, without national governments that could truly overshadow the power of individual nobles, politics was personal. It was not conducted through official channels, so much as through conversation at tables, whispered agreements in corners, and the public choreography of favor and gift-giving. Your hall is not merely a place where you eat and sleep, it is a stage. Every person who enters it, whether guest, petitioner, or rival, becomes an audience to the performance of your power. The placement of chairs is deliberate. The order in which people are greeted is deliberate. The display of your possessions, tapestries, silverware, even the hawks perched in the rafters, is deliberate. They are not random trappings. They are silent statements about your resources, your reach, and the stability of your position. Political maneuvering often happens under the guise of hospitality. Inviting a neighbor to a feast is not just an act of kindness. It is a strategic move. The quality of the food, the entertainment, the attention paid to the guest, and the subtle comparisons to how they were treated elsewhere, all of these become part of the negotiation. A well-fed guest leaves with their pride intact. A slighted one leaves with a seed of resentment. You do not openly threaten. You demonstrate. Marriage alliances are among the most potent tools in this realm. A well-arranged match can secure borders, bring wealth, or connect you to influential families. Negotiations are often protracted, with each side weighing the exchange not only in terms of land or dowry, but in the long-term potential for loyalty or betrayal. These discussions are conducted with care, layered with polite formalities, but beneath the courtesy lies the constant calculation of risk and reward. Culture is another form of currency. Patronage of artists, musicians, and scholars is not only a sign of refinement, but a way to project influence far beyond your own lands. If a poet writes verses in your honor, they are recited in other halls. If you fund the copying of a manuscript, your name might be noted in its margins, traveling with it for generations. This is not idle vanity. It is branding, centuries before the concept existed in its modern form. Tournaments serve a similar double purpose. On the surface, they are displays of martial skill, a chance for knights to prove themselves before an audience. But they are also political theaters. Your presence at a tournament signals allegiance. Your absence can signal disapproval. If you host one, you control the guest list, the seating, and the order of events, all opportunities to elevate allies and quietly sideline rivals. Even the awarding of prizes can be a political act, granting favor in public for deeds that may have been arranged long before the first lance was lowered. Religion, too, is woven into the display. Founding or supporting a chapel, endowing a monastery, or commissioning a relic case is as much about earthly influence as heavenly reward. Clerics often serve as advisors, and their goodwill can open doors in both spiritual and political arenas. The more visibly pious your household appears, the harder it is for rivals to question your legitimacy. Piety can be armor, even if it is worn with a certain calculation. In all of this, perception is as valuable as reality. A noble who appears strong will often be treated as strong, even if their resources are stretched thin. Conversely, a household that shows signs of disarray, neglected repairs, understocked tables, poorly dressed retainers, invites speculation about its decline. This is why so much energy is spent on maintaining appearances, even when the effort itself is costly. To fall behind in the performance of status is to risk being quietly pushed to the edges of power, where influence fades and opportunities vanish. It is an exhausting balance. You must be generous without appearing wasteful, firm without appearing tyrannical, ambitious without appearing disloyal. Every feast, every hunt, every conversation is another move in a game without a clear end, one in which the board itself can shift beneath your feet with the death of a king, the outbreak of war, or the rise of a rival family. And yet, for those who play it well, this game offers rewards that are not measured only in land or coin. There is the satisfaction of outmaneuvering a rival without them realizing they've been outmaneuvered. There is the quiet pride in seeing your name travel on the lips of strangers because of the scholar you funded, the song you inspired, or the tournament you hosted. And there is the deep, unspoken understanding that in the medieval world, survival at the top was never about brute force alone. It was about the art of making people believe you belong there, and ensuring that belief endured long enough for the next generation to inherit it. For all the separation in rank, for all the layers of fabric, stone, and ritual that keep the elite apart from the peasantry, the truth is that medieval life, no matter your station, still bends to the same unyielding forces. Disease does not care for titles. The weather does not check your heraldry before deciding whether to drown your fields in rain or shrivel them with heat. Hunger can visit a hall with carved oak beams, just as surely as it can linger in a wattle and daub cottage, though it tends to knock more quietly at the door of the former. From a distance, the differences are obvious. A peasantess life is defined by the immediacy of labor fields that must be worked today, or the consequences will arrive tomorrow. The elite's labor is abstracted, measured in decisions and alliances, rather than in calloused hands and aching backs. A peasant wakes with the dawn because the day's work demands it. A lord wakes later because someone else's dawn labor has already prepared his bread and stoked his hearth. One moves through life with the rhythm of survival, the other with the rhythm of strategy. And yet, peel back the trappings, and there are points where those rhythms meet. Both peasant and noble eat bread made from the same grain, drink ale brewed from the same barley, hear the same church bells marking the hours. Both depend on the same fragile balance of harvests and herds, on the same tenuous peace between neighbors, on the same roadways that turn to mud in winter. A bad harvest might mean hunger for the peasant and a smaller rent yield for the noble, but in both cases, the winter ahead becomes a season to endure rather than enjoy. Illness is perhaps the most ruthless equalizer. The common cold may pass quickly for one person and turn fatal for another, regardless of station. The plague, when it comes, ignores the walls of the great hall as easily as the doors of the cottage. A noble may have access to a physician, but a physician's knowledge is limited by the medicine of the time, which is to say, limited indeed. Leeches, herbal poultices, and carefully worded prayers are the tools of both healer and hope, and they work or fail with equal unpredictability across the social divide. There are shared vulnerabilities in the fabric of medieval life that even privilege cannot mend. Fire is one. A peasant's thatched roof catches quickly. So too does the rush-strewn floor of a noble hall. Both may lose everything to a spark. Storms and floods claim livestock without checking whether their owner's name appears in the doomsday book. Or, when it comes close enough, strips fields, empties granaries, and leaves homes, grand and humble alike, open to looting. There is also the shared human weight of uncertainty. Neither peasant nor noble knows if the next year will be better or worse. Both live with the awareness that life is finite and fragile, and that fortunes, be they measured in coin or in seed grain, can vanish faster than they are made. And yet, despite these shared threads, the distance between their daily realities remains immense. For the peasant, hunger is a regular visitor. For the noble, it is an unwelcome guest that arrives only in times of true crisis. For the peasant, the seasons dictate every movement. For the noble, the seasons are something to be acknowledged, prepared for, and if possible, used to one's advantage. A failed crop means desperate improvisation for one and strategic trade for the other. But perhaps the greatest contrast lies in the luxury of choice. The elite can choose, within limits, how to respond to hardship. They can shift resources, call in debts, seek aid from allies. The peasant has fewer moves on the board, most of them exhausting, and some dangerous. Still, it would be a mistake to think of the medieval social divide as absolute. Life in the Middle Ages was threaded through with moments where those divides blurred. A harvest festival where everyone danced to the same tune. A shared vigil in the same church. A day of mourning for a death that touched an entire community. In those moments, the human common ground became visible, not as a leveling of status, but as a reminder that beneath the weight of duty, display, and hierarchy, the same wind chilled every face, the same sun warmed every back, and the same uncertainty waited for everyone, high or low. And in those rare spaces of overlap, perhaps each side saw a little more of the other, not enough to close the gap, but enough to recognize that, stripped of symbols and ceremony, both were playing different parts in the same fragile game. Now that we've wandered slowly, without hurry through the many corners of medieval life, it's worth pausing, as one might at the end of a long day's walk, to take stock of where we've been. You began this journey in the rough-hewn dimness of a peasant's morning, with the smell of damp timber and old smoke in the air, your feet finding the cool, uneven floorboards before you'd quite decided to be awake. You stepped into the rhythm of work that began before the sun rose and would end only when the light faded, the day's labor braided tightly with the next day's and the next, in a pattern that left little space for invention, but a great deal of space for endurance. From there, you moved upward into the world of Sir Geoffrey, whose life, though removed from the fields, was no less defined by duty. His mornings were not shaped by the swing of a hoe, but by the weight of armor and a delicate balance of loyalty. His survival was not about coaxing food from the soil, but about maintaining his place in a web of power that could tighten or loosen without warning. You saw him as a boy, sent from home to learn the art of service, and as a man, navigating disputes that were rarely about what they seemed, surviving not through great heroics, but through persistence, caution, and an understanding of when to act and when not to. You drifted, then, into the hazier territory of the Green Children of Woolpit, whose story sat somewhere between fact and folklore, recorded by men who saw no need to tell us everything we now wish we knew. You stood in that Suffolk field in your mind, looking at two children who seemed to have arrived from nowhere, speaking no known tongue, their skin marked by a color no one could quite explain. You watched as they were taken in, as the boy faded and the girl grew into an ordinary life, and you felt, perhaps, the peculiar pull of a mystery that refuses to resolve, content to remain a question mark in the margins of history. From there, the path bent toward the high tables and carved beams of the elite, where life is a performance staged daily for an audience that knows all the cues. You saw the late rising, the deliberate arrangement of chairs and greetings, the meals that are as much about display as about sustenance. You followed the hunts and the feasts, the exchanges of favor wrapped in courtesy, the marriages arranged like chess moves. You saw how politics could hide in the folds of a cloak or in the gift of a hawk, and how the real contest was not in the lists, but in the hall, where words and glances could tilt the balance of power as surely as any sword. And finally, you stood between the worlds, looking at the deep divide between peasant and noble, and the thin threads that still bound them together, the shared fragility in the face of weather, illness, and chance. The same sun setting on the manor house and the cottage roof, the same toll of the church bell, calling each to prayer or warning, the recognition that while their lives were shaped by different tools, different fears, and different ambitions, they were all living within the same fragile framework, one that required constant tending from everyone, high or low. Now, as we reach this point in the journey, you might feel the same quiet weight that would settle over a medieval household at the end of the day, a sense that nothing has been resolved, and yet everything has been completed for now. The tools are set aside, the fire banked, the day's movements committed to memory, not because they were remarkable, but because they were done. And so we sit, in the slow fade of the imagined medieval evening, with all these images: the straw bed, the armored knight, the green children, the feast table stacked gently together, like pages in a book that's been left open on the table. They don't need to be tied up neatly. They only need to be remembered, in the soft way that stories stay with you when the day is done. If you sit for a moment with the picture of medieval life still in your mind, it's hard not to let the edges of the present day creep in for comparison. It's not about deciding which world was better, though for anyone who enjoys central heating, antibiotics, or the ability to turn on a light at night without first striking flint, the answer might be obvious. It's more about holding both pictures side by side and noticing how the shapes of need, comfort, and survival have shifted over time. Consider the morning. In the medieval world, it was governed by the sun, the season, and whatever the day demanded. You woke because light seeped into the cracks of the shutters, because the rooster insisted, or because there was no advantage to lying still any longer. Now, mornings can be manufactured set by alarms, manipulated by blackout curtains, delayed by coffee brewed at the touch of a button. You can decide, to some extent, what your morning feels like. For a medieval villager, the choice was already made before you opened your eyes. Work, too, has transformed. In the Middle Ages, it was physical, immediate, and tied directly to survival. If you did not plant, you did not eat. If you did not repair, you lost shelter. The chain between action and consequence was short and unyielding. In the modern world, many of us work at far greater remove from the physical products of our labor. The connection between effort and sustenance is often hidden behind systems so complex that you could skip a day's work without fearing that your next meal would vanish. That distance is a luxury, but it also makes the stakes less visible. The medieval table, as we've seen, was modest for most and ceremonial for the few. Bread, pottage, ale, these were the constants. Exotic spices were rare treasures, not pantry staples. We can eat strawberries in January, drink coffee from beans grown half a world away, or scroll through endless recipe videos without once wondering if the food will actually be there when we want it. That abundance is as much a product of modern networks as medieval scarcity was a product of its limits. Illness is perhaps the starkest contrast. In the medieval mind, sickness was both a physical and spiritual trial. Without germ theory, causes were often guessed at through a mixture of observation, tradition, and belief. Remedies were rooted in herbal knowledge, bloodletting, and prayer. Survival often came down to luck, resilience, or sheer chance. Today, we can name the pathogens, prescribe targeted treatments, and prevent many diseases outright. The idea that a simple cut might kill you is almost unthinkable now, though in the medieval world, it was a quiet, constant possibility. And yet, for all the progress, there are threads of continuity. We still gather to eat and mark the seasons, though the markers are more often found on calendars than in the sky. We still measure status in objects, though the symbols have shifted from embroidered belts to glowing rectangles of glass. We still navigate hierarchies, professional, social, political, though the titles and costumes have changed. The medieval performance of power has its modern echoes in boardrooms, red carpets, and social media feeds, each stage lit differently, but all built on the same instinct to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be part of the game. Perhaps the most enduring similarity is the quiet fragility beneath it all. The medieval villager knew that a storm could ruin the harvest. We know that a blackout, a supply chain break, or a sudden economic shift can tilt the balance of our own routines. The medieval noble understood that one bad alliance could erode years of stability. We see careers, reputations, and fortunes turn just as quickly, if by different means. The tools and timelines have changed, but the unpredictability remains a constant. And so, when we look at medieval life, it's not only with the comfort of distance, but with a faint recognition. The roof above our heads is different. The work we do is different. The way we light the night is different. But the structure of living, of needing, of balancing between security and loss is still there. The contrast lies in how much control we think we have over it, and in how surprised we are when that control proves to be less solid than it seemed. The great irony of progress is that while it changes the texture of life, it rarely changes its underlying shape. We've covered the centuries between the medieval villager and the modern citizen with layers of invention, convenience, and knowledge, but the bones of the structure remain much the same. People still rise in the morning to meet a list of obligations, still spend their days in service to systems larger than themselves, still measure their worth, often unconsciously, by the recognition of others. In the medieval world, recognition came in clear, tangible forms: a place at the high table, the right to wear certain colors, the ability to have your coat of arms carved above a doorway. Today, the symbols have become more varied and less formal: followers on a screen, a blue checkmark, an office with a view. Both serve the same purpose: to declare your place in the order of things, to reassure you that you have not slipped unnoticed to the margins. We like to think of ourselves as freer than our medieval counterparts, and in some ways, we are. Few of us are bound by birth to a specific lord, and we can, at least in theory, choose our work, our partners, and our places of living. But where medieval obligation was explicit and ceremonial, modern obligation is often invisible. Instead of kneeling to a feudal superior, we log into systems and subscriptions we cannot function without. Instead of owing days of labor to a lord's harvest, we owe months or years of payments to institutions we will never meet face to face. The language has changed, the rituals have changed, but the binding threads still pull. The persistence of social hierarchy is another quiet echo. The medieval noble was separated from the peasant, not just by wealth, but by visible markers in dress, diet, and speech. Today, these divisions are subtler but no less real. Fashion, accents, and even the foods we consider normal or luxury still tell stories about who we are and where we belong. We may pride ourselves on social mobility, but like the medieval ladder, ours narrows sharply at the top. And then there's the irony of labor itself. In the Middle Ages, physical work was the foundation of life. The harvest could not wait. The roof had to be thatched. The animals had to be fed. Now, much of our labor is abstracted, taking place in offices, studios, or in the shifting expanse of the digital world. Yet the basic truth remains. Most of us spend the majority of our waking hours doing work whose ultimate product we may never personally consume, for the benefit of structures we cannot see in full. A medieval plowman might not have grasped the full scope of the Lord's holdings. A modern employee might not grasp the full scope of the corporation's reach. Even our relationship to uncertainty has not evolved as much as we like to think. The medieval villager lived with the constant possibility that one bad harvest could undo years of stability. Today, stability can still be undone in ways just as sudden: a market crash, a natural disaster, a global event that travels faster than news of it can be processed. We have more tools to respond, but those tools are not guarantees. Just as the medieval peasant's extra sack of grain was never a guarantee against famine. And perhaps the most human irony of all, both then and now, we spend a great deal of time imagining that our present is the pinnacle of advancement, that we are far from the crude uncertainties of the past. Medieval people believed themselves to be living in a time of progress, 2 fields better plowed than in their grandparents' day, churches more richly adorned, roads more secure. Every era sees itself as standing at the furthest edge of improvement, looking back with a mixture of pity and pride at what came before. And every era forgets that one day it will be the before someone else looks back on with the same mixture. This persistence, tucked beneath all the change, is strangely comforting. It suggests that while the tools, the structures, and the symbols will continue to evolve, the basic human project of making a life, holding it together, and finding meaning in the spaces between duties remains the same. And maybe that's why medieval history can still speak to us so easily. Beneath the straw beds and armored riders and bean-eating mysteries, it is still our story, told in different clothing and at a slower pace. And so, here we are, at the end of this long, unhurried walk through a world that is both impossibly far away and strangely familiar. We've traced the arc of a single medieval day, from the cold floorboards of a peasantess morning to the high-backed chair of a noble's feast, from the damp straw of a humble bed to the carved oak of a curtained chamber. We've stood in the middle of a Suffolk field with two inexplicable green children, puzzled alongside monks who saw no urgency in solving the riddle. We've followed a knight whose greatest victories were measured, not in songs, but in the quiet endurance of remaining useful. We've moved among the elite as they turned hospitality into politics and hawking into performance. And we've stepped back to see how all of it, high and low, humble and grand, was threaded together by the same weather, the same sickness, the same fragile continuity. Now the images begin to settle, like the embers of a fire, falling into their own faint glow. The hall grows quieter, the last of the trenchers cleared from the tables. Somewhere in the dark beyond the walls, a dog gives a half-hearted bark, then falls silent. In the fields, the wind moves through stubble and grass, carrying the faint smell of damp earth. The sky above, without the glare of any modern light, is thick with stars, the kind of stars that seem both closer and further than you remember they can be. You can feel the weight of the day, the work done, the conversations had, the small negotiations won or lost. In the medieval world, tomorrow will look very much like today, and the day after will look much the same again. There is a kind of comfort in that repetition, even if it comes with hardship. The predictability of the seasons, the rituals of work and rest, the familiar sound of the church bell in the morning, it all holds life in a steady rhythm. Here, in the quiet, you might think of how those rhythms still hum in your own life, even across the centuries. The day ends, the night takes over, the body seeks rest. The details are different, but the shape is the same. And if you listen closely past the creak of the beams, past the whisper of the wind through the shutters, you can almost hear the low, steady breathing of a whole village asleep. It's in that breathing, in that shared surrender to night, that all the divisions dissolve. The knight and the plowman, the lady and the dairymaid, the wandering stranger and the child born in the village, they all close their eyes under the same dark sky. Whatever the day brought, whatever small triumph or quiet loss, it is set aside for now. The fire burns low, the air cools, and the world contracts to the small space where you lie, wrapped in whatever warmth you have, letting the darkness carry you forward. And so we leave the medieval world for tonight, not with the clang of armor or the rise of banners, but with the sound of stillness long, deep, and familiar. The past waits where we left it, unchanged by our visit, ready to be picked up again when we return. For now, you can let it fade, like the last ember slipping into ash, and follow the same path as they did, into the quiet and into sleep.